It's very monkish, don't you think? Sort of like a monastic experience. Can I welcome you all to the Royal Society? My name's Paul Nurse. I'm president of the Society, and it's a pleasure to have a complete full house here this evening. And I think what that indicates is the importance and interest of the scientific community in particular in science in the UK, and their interest in hearing what our three main political parties have to say about it. So it's a pleasure to see you all, and a particular pleasure that the three main parties and the representatives for science are here. They're very, very busy, and I know that to get them all together on the same evening is really quite difficult. And we have, in no particular order, Julian Huppert, Liam Byrne and David Willits, who will be on the panel this evening. We're also privileged tonight to have an excellent chair who you will have seen often in two dimensions. This is Pallab Ghosh on the television with the BBC. And so I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion about something that is very dear to our hearts in this institution particularly, which is science and science's place in culture and in the economy and in the United Kingdom more generally. This is an event that is organised by CaSE, and we are acting as hosts, and I'm going to ask Sarah Main from CaSE now to say a few words. Sarah. Please. I was brought up properly.
Well, we made it. Thank you to all of you who've stuck with us through the shepherding of this debate from its early incarnation in April earlier this year. It's good to see many of you here who signed up for the first incarnation of that debate. Thank you for sticking with us. Hello to all the people watching on Royal Society TV, who are, this debate is being live streamed to them. For all of you in the audience, please do turn your phones to silent, but don't hold back from tweeting about the progress. You can carry on doing that, that's fine. Thank you very, very much to the Royal Society for hosting our debate this evening. You will probably imagine that the diaries of our panellists and our chair are extremely busy, and that's why the debate sometimes has to be rescheduled from one date to another. Therefore, the venue and the hosting of the event has to be changed as well. And the Royal Society stepped in at really the last minute to host this event for us, and we are extremely grateful to them for this magnificent venue and for their hosting of our reception. I'll just say a few tiny little words about CaSE. CaSE is really great. It's a plucky little organisation that does a lot with a very little. So little, in fact, that our budget would be lost in the rounding errors of most organisations' budget calculations. We exist on subscriptions from our members, and I know many of our members are here in the audience tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being members. If you're watching on Royal Society TV or you're here in the audience and you're not a member, then please do join us. Every little that is subscribed to CaSE makes a huge difference. And while you're at it, ask your organisation, whether it's a company or a university, if they're a member of CaSE, and get them to join too. Thank you. So, most importantly, thanks to all of our panel members and our chair. All of them have made substantial rearrangements in their diary to be here tonight, and we are extremely grateful to them. They've stuck with us through thick and thin on this, and I think it shows enormous commitment for them to want to be here with you, the members of the science and engineering community, to discuss the future of science and engineering in the UK. All of them deserve great thanks. I particularly want to single out Liam Byrne, who took on the brief of Universities, Skills and Science Minister only 3 weeks ago. Thank you very much for stepping up to this challenge of honouring the commitments made by his predecessor, Shabana Mahmood. So I really want to know what they have to say about their vision of the future for science and engineering in the UK, and I'm sure you do too. Please join in our debate, and please join me in welcoming the panel and the chair.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Paul. And let me add my welcome to the CaSE Science and Engineering debate. Now, naively, I kind of think that science is one area where the main political parties agree. Like apple pie, I think all three of my panellists will think that science is a good thing and that there should be more of it. Where they might disagree is how best to harness our science space and how to nurture it. And, if I may say, how much to spend on it. So this is our chance to quiz the people that might be in charge of, what happens to our science space going forward. And in particular, getting some of the detail. I'm sure there's going to be lots of warm words from all of you, but we're going to try and pin you down a little bit to see, what you have in mind for our future, for something that we all care about so much. The format this evening is a question time style event. I have to say that as someone who's short-sighted, I shall keep in the question time style of getting the sexes of people wrong, so do bear in mind. So if I say a gentleman over there, so do forgive me in advance. Questions have been submitted from the audience. They've been pre-selected, and the audience will be, those chosen will be asking the questions. The panellists have had no knowledge of them, so they'll be giving spontaneous answers. And we'll be having about 10 minutes per question. And I'd ask our very eloquent panellists to try and keep their initial answers as concise as they're able to. So there's time for a bit of debate between the three of you, and also, if possible, some questions from the audience. So I think it's going to be a great evening. And in the spirit of concision, let's move on to our first question, which is from Mario Chisholm, who is an Associate Commercial Director from the Laboratory of the Government Chemist, or LGC, as we know it. Mario, is Mario here? Mario's just over there.
Good evening. There's been much interest in the perceived STEM skills gap for well-trained practical scientists. What would our panellists propose as a solution to fill this skills gap?
So, in no particular order, since you're next to me, Julian, what's your answer to that?
Can I just, before we do that, say thank you very much to everybody for coming. And actually, I think it's really good that we can do this. And I just also want to start off because I think one of the great things, as people have said, is that science isn't a place where we have the normal party knockabout. And actually, that's been quite good. We have had over the years people who care about science at a high level from each party. So David Sainsbury from Labour, David Willits from the Conservatives, and Vince Cable from the Liberal Democrats. And it's actually great that we can argue about how we move forwards rather than some of the slagging off that does happen if you've ever watched Prime Minister's Question Time. In the interest of concision, can I also just advertise, I wrote a detailed paper on most of this, which I'm not going to read out. But if you want to follow it on Royal Society TV, it's at tinyurl.com/scipol, SCIPOL, and you can see the full details and references there. But there is no doubt there is a massive skills gap, and it's a real problem. And I agree that it's about practical people who can actually do things at a high level. And that's whether it's engineers, we're probably 20,000 engineers short, whether it's people who can actually do computer science and the coding side as opposed to the playing games side, and every step throughout. And there's lots that are happening. The government's done things like university technical colleges. We have one in Cambridge that's just being built. There's a huge amount there. For me, a lot of it starts with getting young people interested in science. So it's about making sure that primary schools have science specialists in each school who get it. Secondary schools have a chance for CPD, for teachers to catch up, so that they're not always forced to be slightly shaky about teaching physics with a biology degree or whichever way around it might be. And we're nowhere near that. And when I was writing this policy paper, I had a chilling conversation with a colleague who taught primary school teachers. And she said she got them to come up with a curriculum, and every single group left out science. And she asked why, and I said, well, it's hard, dull, and not very useful, so why would you teach it? And as long as we have primary school teachers who think that way, we're always going to have people falling off. And there are lots of other issues about gender, about access to further training and so on. But for me, it really starts right at that beginning with getting people to get the idea that science is fun. It's not just a list of facts, it's really exciting. and let's try and actually teach people to do science, not just about science.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you for your concision. Liam, I've sort of noticed that the number of people taking A-level science is increasing, so part of that battle is being won, but is the only way of increasing the skills base through university degrees, because we need to try and get people scientifically literate at every level? Are there apprenticeships, other ways of doing it?
Yeah. Well, 3 weeks into the job, I'm afraid I'm going to offer you more enthusiasm than expertise this evening. But I hope to offer you an awful lot of enthusiasm and an awful lot of excitement. I'm the son of a science teacher. My mum was a biology teacher in comprehensive schools, roundabouts where we grew up. And so I can't but start where Julian started, which is I think this has got to start in the classroom. And I think we've done an awful lot over the last 10 or 15 years. But look, the UK Commission on Employment and Skills says that we need about 750,000 more research professionals by 2020 or something. 500,000 of those actually to replace those who are going to retire. So you're absolutely right to say this is a hugely urgent problem. Now, I do think it's got to start in the classroom. I think it's a worry that we missed our quotas for physics teachers this year by about half. A bit better in computer science, but there is still a recruitment gap. And I will just kind of leave it to you in the audience to reflect on whether a policy that allows teachers without qualifications to operate in free schools and in academies is a good way to solve this problem for the future. And for those who are kind of really interested in that, let me point you to the Ofsted report on the Al Medina School, and in particular its commentary on the way that maths was taught by cutting out shapes and sticking them together on bits of paper. Now, I think actually, we need to reflect on whether that is a good way to train our young people at that early stage. The second point, my second rung on the ladder, I suppose, is the careers service. And look, the truth is that in many schools around the country now, the careers service is practically becoming extinct. And this is a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem for diversity in our future science workforce. And I think it's a huge problem in just drawing as many people as we need into the workforce. Now, I think one of the things that I hope we can do before the election is a good cross-party discussion on how we rebuild the careers service. I note with interest that the way it's done in Germany is you've got great expertise in the Federal Employment Service. They're in talking with schools and young people, not after they do their options or before they're about to push off after school. They're talking to them before they take their options at the age of 13. Industry can help with this. I mean, I'm sort of helping promote something that the National Grid are doing in my constituency called Careers Lab. It's about getting people involved in the practicalities of what they're doing to kind of inspire them into further maths study and into science. So schools are important, careers are important, further education hugely important. I mean, you're right to say we do need a much bigger supply of people going up through what we hope will be a technical baccalaureate, into technician class, into registered scientist and chartered scientists and so on. We're all worried about higher education and the future of the funding settlement. I mean, in my 3 weeks, I've not yet met a Vice-Chancellor. Maybe there'll be one tonight who will buck the trend. I've not yet met a Vice-Chancellor who's told me that the current funding structure is sustainable for too much longer. That's a big worry. And lots of us are worried about what's happening with postgraduates too, and the 3% decline that we've seen over the last year. So, there are things that we need to do, I think, at every rung on the ladder, and I hope we'll come back to the vexed issue of immigration a bit later in the debate, because it's not just about building ladders, it's also about building bridges.
Well, let's come to immigration straight away. David, one solution is to kind of let scientists come from overseas, but your government's policy on that doesn't help in that regard.
Well, we can indeed recruit scientists from overseas, and when I visit labs and meet researchers and postgrads, you meet people from Germany and France and Italy and the US and China alongside Brits. I would say we have some of the most international research labs anywhere in the world, and a good thing too. But we shouldn't give up on our own kind of domestic challenge of training and educating people for science by saying, don't worry, we can always just recruit them from somewhere else. So we do have some domestic policy. But before I turn to them, can I just say I am very grateful to CaSE and the Royal Society for bringing this together, and I would always be very happy to debate with Liam, and welcome to your post, and Julian, on this very important subject. And there is, I hope, a lot of cross-party agreement. The way I think of it is for us in Britain, there is a challenge on the demand side and on the supply side. The demand side challenge is getting young people interested and excited in science. And I personally think we don't do enough to take advantage of the big, exciting things that are happening. And that's why I was very pleased to be able to put some funding into Bloodhound. You know, the challenge, when you meet some slightly disgruntled teenagers hanging around a bit of engineering that they don't completely understand and say to them, would you like to meet the only man in the world who has ever driven a car through the sound barrier? At that point, you get their attention. And what Andy Green has done and all that is fantastic. We've now got 5,000 schools using Bloodhound as a project to get kids interested in science and engineering. And secondly, and this is partly a challenge to the sector, I don't think people have yet fully realised the opportunity we've now got with Tim Peake's flight to the space station, with 6 months there to do real experiments. And that is another fantastic opportunity to get people interested in science. Indeed, if I remember correctly, the distinguished president of the Royal Society, life scientist, if I remember rightly, Paul, you said that your first interest in science came from astronomy and space. And I think the rule is it's normally either space or dinosaurs that first get you interested in it. And so there's the demand side, just using those type of opportunities, which we in government will obviously fund through our science communication budget, but the more that people in the science community harness them, the better. Then there's the kind of supply side, what we deliver. Some of the basic figures aren't too bad. And we have got an increase in the number of people doing A-levels in the sciences. Well, I was very chastened, however, with a conversation with a guy running a big international company. And I said to him, what's the difference between a British engineering graduate and a German engineering graduate? And he said, they both have learnt the same kind of engineering. They both have read the same textbooks. We would assume they both knew the same amount of engineering stuff. The difference is I would leave a German engineering graduate responsible for one of our big pieces of kit overnight, and I wouldn't a British engineering graduate. And what he meant by that was he thought our education had become very much paper-based and academic, and it was involved insufficient engagement with the expensive bits of kit that you really need to be properly trained. And that conversation was one of the things that triggered the thought that led to our extra 200 million for teaching capital that I was able to announce the other week, with a challenge to universities, incidentally, to find matching funding. Because I would like to see well-equipped labs where people who study life sciences are ready to go and do wet lab work with GSK, where people who do engineering are ready to go and work with Rolls-Royce. And that actually is more the criticism I hear than worry about the absolute numbers. It's worry that people haven't had as many practical experiences as they need. And the other little thing I was able to do with that increase in teaching capital, incidentally, was say that one of the conditions for receipt of capital should be participating in some kind of program for diversity like Athena Swan. Because if there's an area where we are wasting and not using talent for science and engineering, it is the so many girls and young women who in other countries would be doing in science and engineering, and in Britain they aren't, and it's a national scandal, and we've got to tackle it.
Thank you, David. And there'll be a question on diversity a little later on. Just very briefly, let's get a few comments from the floor and just return to our panel for responses. Just one response to what you said, David, in that my uninformed, unscientific view is that there has been a shift in attitudes to science. I think science is cool. There has been a generational shift. And I think what the priority has to be is just following that through and turning that into real jobs that benefit the science space. But is there anyone that would like to make very brief comments, and then we'll just return to the panel? The hand up over in the middle there, and anyone else? Just says,
hi.
There's a hand over there. If you could say who you are and what your comment is.
Yeah, I'm Ashley Brown. I work at a startup just over the road. I've done a PhD, so I've been in the university system for a while. All three panellists have focused on getting young people involved, and that's very important to get them started at primary level. But that's got a 20-year lead time, and at the moment we do have an unemployment problem in the country. It is going down, but we do still have one. And there are lots of young people who have left university who maybe can't find jobs. So what would you do by 2020 to solve the shortage without waiting for the 20-year lead time from the primary school students?
And let me just take one more comment. We're already kind of past our time for this session, but anyway, let's just try and squeeze another question in. The person over there.
Hello, I'm Jordan Eyre. I'm studying aerospace engineering at University of West of England. And I hear a lot about how there's been a generational shift and how science is becoming more of a thing for the younger generation. But how do we change an appreciation for science from the general Steve Jobs sort of Apple and technology, the general appreciation for technology we have nowadays, into an appreciation for the nitty-gritty of science and engineering itself?
So if I can just ask each of you to be relatively brief, because we've still got a few questions to get through. Liam, first. You were keen to talk about the follow-through.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. I was going to agree with you first that I think there has been a change in attitude. This job is by far and away the job that my children are most excited about by some distance. Look, there's 1 million young people out of work. I mean, that is a national scandal. And it's not just costing us a fortune today, it's going to cost us a fortune for years to come. Billions, in fact, in lost output now. And it's why, we are, amongst others, saying that there should be much more concerted action. What we have found going around the country over the last year is that businesses are up for getting stuck in. They often don't know who to call, they don't know how to help, but very often they're ashamed of the high level of youth unemployment in their area. But you have to get the skills system and the back to work system to work together in a completely different way if we're going to solve this problem. Now, that is not the view of a left-wing radical. That's the view of Michael Heseltine too. Other countries have done well, like Canada and Germany, by radically devolving control of some parts of the skills system. That allows you to put together skills funding and back-to-work funding in a much readier way. I was interested, actually, that you were someone who had started a business too. I do think that there is that the generation coming through universities at the moment, my observation, and I see this in my constituency, is massively more entrepreneurial, even than my generation. I mean, it took me to the age of 30 before I started a technology business. There are lots and lots of young people now who are desperate to start a business. And actually, there's a great group of colleges like the Gazelle Group, and you can see this in particular in Sheffield, I think, where they are thinking pretty radically across the city about how they make their further education colleges and, to an extent, their universities real hubs of entrepreneurial inspiration. That basic message that you can do this too. Certainly for me, that was, I went to Harvard Business School. That's where I got that message for the first time. There are many others who I think would profit from that message much earlier.
Liam, I'm sorry to...
Yeah, not at all.
Sure. Some in David's party might think of Michael Heseltine as a left-wing radical. but anyway, David.
He's a great man. Yes. I worked for him, actually. I was his junior minister when he was the Deputy Prime Minister a very long time ago. On this, just several things, very briefly. First, you're right about the need for opportunities for people who've already emerged through the education system. And one thing we can do is spread access to apprenticeships beyond the under-19s. And I think it'd be great if Liam agreed that apprenticeships being taken up by over-19s is not a policy failure. There is a kind of model sometimes, unless you are a 17-year-old, and this is a government failing to deliver more apprentices. Some of the increase in apprenticeships has come from people over 19, and a good thing too. Secondly, we have to ensure as well that we support employers in funding the kind of skills training they need, and why we're running some what we call employer ownership pilots, where we give the employers the funding to pay for training without specifying in as much detail as we used to exactly what they had to do with it. And then thirdly, a part-time study enabling people whilst they are working also to get a new qualification, including in the sciences. And I am very disappointed that we might talk about our university reforms on another occasion. I think much of what we've done has worked, but I'm very disappointed by the decline in the number of part-time students. And as we try to understand why that is, because we've extended student loans to part-time students the first time, but we try to understand why that is. One reason I have to say is the ELQ policy of the previous company. I mean, if you'd already got a degree, you couldn't do a course, say, if you wanted to move to a STEM subject. And that's why I've finally been able to take the first step to reversing that policy by extending part-time loans for part-time students doing some STEM subjects, even if they had already done a previous degree in a different area.
David, thanks very much. Julian?
I mean, all the comments about apprenticeships being at any point in the life are absolutely right, and retraining should be at any point in life. I have to confess, I started another degree a bit later, though I dropped out because my first year exams were the same time as the general election, and that was a bit too much for anybody, or so at least for me. And there are some great things that the Open University do to try to encourage people. There is the real issue that if we're going to change the education system, there is a lag, and there will always be a lag for people to get skills there. There are people who could come in who are not getting engaged as much, people who are older, who don't necessarily get employed as easily in some of these areas as they should do, and we are definitely not making the most of not just women but also ethnic minorities and a whole series of other groups. I do think immigration does have a role. I don't want to put David in a hard spot because I know he's actually arguing the right way in the internal discussions, and I think it'd be interesting to get Theresa May here perhaps to explain some of her policies. But you know, David's definitely on the right side of these things as a loyal government minister, I'm sure. But it is an issue that when I talk to the companies in the sort of Cambridge Tech cluster, or when I talk to the universities, it is a pain to get students. It is a pain to get academics. It is a pain to get people to do vivas and all sorts of things. And actually, while we shouldn't use that as a replacement for people here, absolutely we need to focus on training, we will never be the world leader in every single field of research. You know, we'll never do it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. We will always want to have that free flow. And unfortunately, the debate on immigration is going exactly the wrong way to help us to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. Our second question is about innovation, and it's from Stephen Patterson from the high technology Cambridge-based company ARM. Stephen.
Thank you very much. My question is really about what would the panel do, what more would the panel do, I suppose, to drive high-tech economic growth in the UK across innovation, across science and engineering? And it seems to me there are two approaches to this. One is, if I ask, what special areas of research do you think might deserve additional funding to underpin that economic growth? And the other is whether you think there are non-cost levers, non-financial levers, which government could use in implementing policies that would also stimulate high-tech economic growth more than is currently the case.
Well, I think one of the biggest things can be done is to preserve the funding. David, you were successful in maintaining a ring fence for the science budget. Do you think you can do the same again, were you to be doing the job in a few years' time?
Yes, I mean, I don't see why not. We've only got public spending plans to 15-16, but if you look at what we have been able to do by way of a long-term capital settlement, where the Chancellor has exceptionally identified one or two priority areas, transport and science, notably for a guaranteed capital budget to 2020. That shows we are absolutely serious about this. And this is a capital budget of over £1 billion a year in real terms every year from 2014-15 to 2020. This is actually a fantastic opportunity for the science community, and we will draw on the advice of the science community to take some big strategic decisions about how we invest over the next 5 years in, you know, projects on the scale of and as successors to the Crick Institute, which are the big international science infrastructure projects we wish to join. I don't think the community has quite appreciated the scale of the opportunity we now have to have a proper strategic long-term plan for science capital. And I'll be working and consulting the sector on that. On the sort of particulars of how we back innovation, I think we've got some quite good new systems. I mean, the previous Labour government, Peter Mandelson commissioned Herman Hauser. At the same time as my party in opposition, we commissioned James Dyson. And almost the same time, the Hauser report came out and James Dyson's report came out, and they had a very similar proposal that we should learn from the German Fraunhofer model. And we were very happy to do that. And we've now got 7 catapult centres with more to come. We've got Catalyst funding that links research councils and the TSB in a way that we hadn't before, and I was very pleased to keep the TSB. I thought it was a great David Sainsbury creation that we were happy to back, and it's now got increased funding. I think we can do... I think where there's a kind of taboo, where I think we've gone further than previous governments, is people were so terrified of picking winners that they were not willing to back any kind of judgment about technologies. And the fact is that there are so many options out there. You need to take some kind of view. It's not going to be 100% right. You are going to make mistakes. But the Chancellor and I think it was first here in the Royal Society, the Chancellor and I have identified 8 great technologies where we think we've got world-class science and technology, where Britain's got a comparative advantage, where there are big opportunities for the future, and we are systematically backing those with funding. And perhaps in 10 years' time, the Public Accounts Committee will summon me and say, synthetic biology never delivered what you promised, or there never was that breakthrough in energy storage. We're still using the batteries that were basically invented in Oxford in the 1980s. I don't know. But I think you have to take a view about, because you can't do everything, on professional advice, and we have done that more boldly, I think, than governments for 30 years, and I think it's one of the ways you support innovation.
Liam, picking winners was a Labour Party policy. Do you mind that it's been stolen by your colleagues?
Well, no, I think the point is we're not picking winners, because all too often, as we learned in the early 70s, you end up with the losers picking government rather than government picking winners. And that's a problem. But I should preface these remarks by saying that this is hugely important. I mean, this is the one thing that I've probably thought most about in public policy over the last 15 years. It's what was at the heart of the book I wrote about Britain and how Britain pays its way in the Asian century. But I should preface these remarks by saying one of the reasons I'm so excited about this role is that I know I am now shop steward in chief amongst the Labour Party, who will go and fight for ring-fenced long-term funding for science, not just for applied research and for innovation, but for science. And I will be drawing on many of you in some of those battles over the next couple of years. And I plan to use every ounce of my experience as the Chief Secretary in the last government to help win that argument. I think I would kind of characterise my answer basically by saying there's got to be a triple shift. Shift one has got to be from short term to long term. David has done a great job getting a long-term capital settlement out of the Treasury. That's fantastic. We now need to see a long-term allocation to research councils with a strategy to go with it. The stuff on 8 technologies is brilliant. That's a great start. But we mustn't ever get stuck into the trap of big, shiny project syndrome when it comes to science capital. We need the Haldane principle to live alive and well. We need ring fences. We need long-term allocation. I think that's hugely important. So I hope one of the things that we will be able to agree before the election between the parties is that the ring fence should continue. As John Denham said here to CaSE, I think, back in 2011, we think there's an excellent case for putting capital back inside the ring fence. And while we're at it, we shouldn't forget the 2.2 billion that's spent by the Ministry of Defence and the Department of Health, and we should be asking, well, where is the defence industrial strategy? David's breathed great new life into the Office of Life Science. Is that working as effectively as it should too? Those two departments spend 40%, money equivalent to 40% of the science budget. We mustn't sort of forget them. So can we get a long-term framework for current, for capital, and for the big spend in the big government departments? That's shift one. Shift two, I think, is from domestic to global. I mean, the global lab has always been a big feature of the way science and innovation is done in Britain. But look, 96% of R&D spending is abroad, and that is going to increase. When you think China's spending $2 trillion over the course of this 5-year plan, taking R&D spending up to about 2.2% of GDP, there's going to be more of that money abroad. And so an idea that David Sainsbury had, science bridges, increased participation in international alliances, strengthening our diplomatic science work, these are things that are incredibly important. And then I guess shift three is about innovation into the regional economy. I mean, you're incredibly blessed in Cambridge with the way that you have been able to do this over so many years. We should be looking very hard at countries like Israel, where they have a fantastic ecology of city-region-based venture finance that interrelates very effectively with national institutions. In their case, the Office of the Chief Scientist, our equivalent would be the Technology Strategy Board. But look, productivity in this country right now is 7% lower than it was back in 2010. Investment is still 20% lower than it was back in 2010. The venture capital industry shrank by 20% last year, yet corporate cash balances are going up and up and up. 80% of the jobs created since the election are low skill, not high skill. So, we've got to get this right. And so that innovation shift into expanding, the number of good jobs with good wages in high-tech industries regionally, that's my shift 3.
Yeah, sorry again to interrupt. I'm sure if you were able to achieve a cross-party consensus on a ring fence, that would be welcomed by many people in the room. But let's remember a ring fence, a freeze, is an effective year-by-year cut. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. Julian, what are your thoughts?
A number of things. Firstly, it was really exciting to hear Liam talk about what he was just saying about trying to get some more money in, because in this paper that I mentioned earlier, I said we need to get cross-party agreement on a 15-year, 3% above inflation ring fence covering all of the broad research money, revenue and capital. And I've been trying to get the other two parties to sign on to that. And if that's a yes, that would be fantastic. And if the three of us can do that, that would be marvellous. Because I've been trying to get your predecessors to be interested in that for a long time. And also, it's great to see how interconnected these things are. David spoke about the work that Herman Hauser did on the Technology Innovation Centres. Of course, Herman is one of the people who set up ARM in the first place. And for anybody who doesn't know ARM in Cambridge, by the way, it's a fantastic designer of silicon chips. And there are now rather more ARM chips in the world than there are human arms, which is quite good when you can outsell body parts. And it's a great example of how you can have an IP.
What would Lib Dems would approve of the same?
It's quite
hard-hearted Thatcherite Conservatives might, but Lib Dems would never agree to a market in body parts.
Absolutely wasn't in the coalition.
Just clarify that point, please.
I'm regretting the flippant comments already. But ARM, one thing that's great about ARM is the demonstrator you can do things on IP, that it doesn't have to be tied necessarily to manufacturing. And ARM takes the money from the IP side, not the manufacturing side. But to come to your question about what we can do financially and non-financially to help. On a financial scale, there's a lot of things, and I think a lot of it is about make it easier for smaller companies to take a risk to try something new. So I'm really pleased that we recreated the Smart Awards, which were created by the last government, then abandoned, and have now come back. I won one with a biotech company, which was very good at getting publicity and very bad at having any working product. So I've been through that. But that is a really good way of helping really risky things to actually happen. Similarly, there's a huge amount you can do with procurement from small and medium enterprises, because we know, and there's lots of research, that companies which have a customer for their first thing always do much better. Research and development tax credits have been a huge success trying to flow things. Of course, there's a lot of other schemes about that to get people over that hurdle. Finding things which are non-financial is harder to think of. There are lots of things, and they come to the skills gap, the immigration things, and so on. I think it's best described by, I think it was Andy Hopper, who said that the real aim of government policy ought to be to create a low-risk environment for individuals to take high risks. So to enable people to try something, and then it doesn't matter if you fail, you try something else. And actually, I think there's a lot that other places could learn from Cambridge, but part of it is that once you have a cluster, you can try something risky, because if it doesn't work, you can get another job without having to move house. And once you've got enough things around, and we find that the partners of people working in the high-tech business in Cambridge often themselves work in the high-tech business, and they seem to take alternate risks. So while one partner is having a more stable job, the other one will be in the really risky startup, and they'll swap over. So there's a lot you can do about making it a safe environment to try something unusual. That also helps, if you want to get clusters going, to have things like pubs where people can talk, and startup spaces where people can bump into each other and have interactions.
Julian, thanks very much. We're already behind schedule, so we'll just move on to the next question, if that's all right, which is about Blue Skies research from Graham Smith from Imperial College. Graham.
Do you think that in advertising itself to policymakers as a way to improve economic growth, science is removing its mandate and ability to do blue sky research?
Liam, if I could start with you. I mean, David has been very successful in selling science to George Osborne on the basis of economic growth. But is that a kind of risky strategy in your view?
I personally don't think purity and practicality are enemies. I do think they're allies. And there's no better illustration of that than the Royal Society. Isaac Newton was a great theoretician, but he was also a pretty good reorganiser of the nation's currency. And I think that there is an appreciation. I actually even think there's an appreciation in the Treasury that you have got to let the scientific process take its course. And actually, one of the reasons that we are so good at science in this country is that we have had that long-term framework, we have had those ring fences in place, and we've had them for an awful long time. And that's been tremendously good for science. I mean, the extra money has helped a great deal too, of course, but actually having that long-term approach to things, I think, has been pretty successful. And look, look back over 300 years worth of British capitalism. The Royal Society was just as important as the Royal Exchange and the Royal Navy in creating the economy and the great trading nation that we have today. So I don't think there's too much cause to be alarmed, but the price of that certainty, I'm afraid, is constant vigilance. We have got to constantly guard the risk that money will bleed over the line from pure science into applied research and innovation funding. But I think there is an appreciation now that you've got to do both. You've got to keep the both in balance. And it's actually why debates like this are so important, because I do think that appreciation is something that's shared across all parties now.
Julian, do you have a sense that science has got to justify itself economically far more at the cost of doing the thing that will be the next graphene, that will be the next semiconductor chip?
I think there is a huge risk, and the scientific community, in every single sense, from the minister down, made a great effort to show the benefits of science. That's been really successful in securing at least a cash freeze in funding. That was a huge success. There's been lots and lots of detailed works about the contribution of chemistry to the economy and physics to the economy. There's a slight problem if you add them all up. You discover that science is contributing about 130% of our GDP. So maybe there may be some multiple counting, or we're not counting the negative effect of economists or something. But there is no doubt that it is essential for our long-term economic benefit. The things that will keep Britain doing things in 2050, there's no doubt it's driven by the research that we do today. But there is a risk in overselling it. And I think there is a slight risk, and please don't anybody tell the Chancellor, that we may have pitched the idea that there are very short-term economic returns which will feature very quickly. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. It will sometimes be the case, and there's no doubt that the trained people who come out of a research programme, for example, they are an economic benefit. Just having the training, even if the research project didn't technically produce the outcomes that were wanted, that's still a huge benefit. But we have to make sure that there is that space for blue skies, that in the focus on impact, and I filled in those pieces of paper myself, we keep open the space of not really sure exactly what this will do, but it's really quite interesting and worth trying. There has to somewhere be that space, because if you look at any of the really earth-shattering changes, whether it's lasers, monoclonal antibodies, World Wide Web, anything, it didn't start off with somebody saying, I know exactly what this will do, I can fill in my impact thing with my grant and say in 5 years it'll make this much money. You simply can't do it. So we should do our best to benefit from what we do and from the research, but you have to keep that fun, that excitement of doing something that's just really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julian. David, I was here a few months ago and I saw George Osborne talking about science, and I had a sense that he really enjoyed talking. So you've done a great selling job, but you have sold it to him on the grounds of him being able to raise more taxes and have more money to spend.
That's certainly a very helpful argument, and turning up in the Treasury and not using arguments about his economic effect would be trying to argue with one hand tied behind your back. But I agree with what Liam said. There isn't a kind of Mephistophelian pact where science has had to sell its soul in order to get funded. And we completely understand that there is just, people are scientists because they're driven by a deep curiosity to understand the world. And I was trying to think of an example as my colleagues were talking. The square kilometre array. I went down to South Africa the other week to see what they're doing at the square kilometre array. Look, you can, which I very much hope we can take a leading role in, and again, it's something we're able to back. You can say that it will just be amazing if that gets closer to the first light than any previous radio astronomy experiment has been able to do. And that is just the challenge which excites a lot of the scientists. You can say that the computing capacity required to handle a flow of data from the square kilometre array greater than the current flow of data across the web will drive innovation in hardware and software in Daresbury and elsewhere in Britain. And you can also say, we've got a great tradition of radio astronomy. It's what Jodrell Bank and Bernard Lovell were all about. We should be true to those traditions. We've been great in the past. We should honour our debt to those pioneers and carry on doing it. Those are not inconsistent arguments. They're different arguments. But I can tell you that George enjoys and appreciates all of those arguments. It isn't simply that you have to turn up and simply talk about high-performance computing. It is also worthwhile, and it is also being true to our traditions as a great scientific nation. And that's why we're absolutely not trying to reduce scientific inquiry to utilitarian calculations of exactly the economic benefit from a particular project, because a lot of the time people can't know, and we shouldn't expect them to claim to foresight that they don't possess.
David, one of the concerns by many people in this room is that scientific inquiry is being limited. I mean, you've kind of maintained a ring fence, but inflation's taking its toll. There's less and less money to spend, and some fantastic projects are not being funded, but certain pet projects like graphene and other things that you've sold are being funded. And so possibly we are missing out on the next World Wide Web.
Well, I don't agree. Well, two answers to that. I mean, first of all, okay, it is a cash protected budget. I have to say, given that we inherited a situation where, what was your expression, Liam? No money left.
It's quite famous.
Sorry, there's no money left. Yeah, I'll only refer to it once in every debate we do, I promise. Given that we inherited that scenario, my thing is that being able to...
There's even less now.
being able to stick with the cash protection was good. And we had got... I think it's a reasonable challenge to the science community. Let me level with the science community. It is a reasonable challenge to the community to say, look, everyone else is expected to deliver efficiency savings and improvements in performance. Can you eke out... because it's a ring fence, every pound you save by doing things differently or more efficiently is a pound that is guaranteed to stay for the use of science. So, for example, I have been struck by the way in which different university labs are sharing much more information about their kit, are pooling resource, are being smarter about how they use equipment. And when I see exercises, and Sarah herself was involved in this, like N8, where the northern 8 research-intensive universities are planning very carefully. So who's going to buy this expensive spectroscope, and how are we going to divide it up, rather than just having pieces of equipment that might not be used 100% of the time? I think we can expect those type of improvements in performance in the science community, and those, if they're delivered, means that the real activity can be maintained as well. And let me end, and this is a challenge I now want to make to my colleagues who were talking earlier about science spend. Both, as I understand it, both Labour and Lib Dems, certainly Julian, believe that university fees should be reduced. Every £1,000 off university fees, which of course students don't pay up front, is basically £1 billion taken from our universities. There is 1 million students, so if you take if you reduce fees by £1,000, it's £1 billion you lose. If you go down to £6,000 fees, that's £3 billion you lose. Now, I'm absolutely sure that Liam, with that policy, will be arguing to Ed Balls, Ed, I need public expenditure to rise to reinstate grants to universities to replace the fee income that universities are losing. But that, when money is tight, in fact, Liam just said it's even tighter, that will have to be his first ask. My view is they will be hard-pressed even to replace the income going into our universities that will be lost if they lower fees. The idea there'll be anything left over for further improvements in science spending, I think is implausible given the fact that we still have an underlying structural fiscal deficit.
Thank you, David, for deftly avoiding my question. But, but anyway, you've raised some questions for Liam and Julian.
I mean, there is, the misplacing of growth, if I can put it like that, over the last 3 years does mean that we actually missed the target that Alistair and I set of halving the deficit over 4 years. But I think this question actually underlines why you have got to have a long-term framework and long-term allocations for capital as well as for resource. And we have got to desperately avoid the trap of announcement-based politics when it comes to serious capital investments in science. And so, the sooner we can, explore getting capital back inside the ring fence from which it was extracted a few years ago, I do think the better. On higher education finance, look, I mean, it's all of us are going to have work to do ahead of our manifestos in 2015. As soon as the Government Accounting Office revalues, the assumptions around non-payment on the current student loan finance system and recalculates the RAB charge, then there's going to be a pretty serious hit to the existing system. So, I mean, none of us should pretend that we don't have, all of us, issues to work through over the next sort of 4 or 5 months before we get to manifesto time.
Thank you. Julian?
I mean, just to pick up David's challenge, and he's right that I'm not a fan of the fee system. I was an undergraduate when Labour brought in fees after promising not to, and I was on many of the marches against fees at the time, and I've been consistently opposed the whole time. And part of it was that, I mean, there are financial issues. There's also the issue of what it says to students, and I've seen the way students behave change. That student society became less egalitarian when the fees came in, because people had significantly differing amounts of spending money. And I saw that change while I was a student. I saw that change later on when I was a director of studies. I could see the differences. And it's made a much larger difference to students and what people choose to do and why. And university is a time where I think it is worth doing things which you find interesting, not just that will be driven by how much financial return you'll make afterwards. It is an absolutely fair comment about where you get the money from. And I think that is a huge, huge challenge. Which is why at our recent conference we agreed that while ideally we would still like to look at trying to get rid of it, I can't honestly find out where the money could be to do that at the next election. I'm not going to say I'll come up with magic money. I think there is a lot of money that could be found to start to help. I think actually a priority would be to help with bursaries for living expenses for students, and I think there is a lot of that for people from poorer backgrounds, but that strikes me as the first thing that I would want to expand, because the repayment scheme is relatively good. People are beginning to understand you don't pay £27,000 at the beginning. It's definitely a lot better. You pay back less than you did under the previous scheme. But it's the living expenses which hit people, and that forces people to change their behaviour very substantially while they're a student, to the detriment of themselves at future. I think there are places one could get money from, and I've argued on various things within the defence budget. I think having fewer expensive appeals by making decisions right the first time round could save a lot of money in various sectors of government. A lot of that money could go there. One could not have married tax advantages to help a very small subset of people. Happy to put that money towards student bursaries.
So will you at the next election be saying in Cambridge that fees should stay at 9,000 or that they should be reduced?
I will be saying at the next election, I don't know the exact wording that will be used, is that I would like to see fees scrapped, but I don't know where the money would come from that, and any money I could find towards it would be used to provide bursaries to help students with what they're going to do.
Sorry, we have to move on to something else. It's a question on...
Big leaflet, isn't it?
It's a question on international competitiveness from Emma Stoy from the Royal Society of Chemistry. Emma.
So if you look at all of our G8 competitors, the UK invests the second lowest proportion of GDP on research and development. So I guess my question is, how can we ensure that science in the UK remains globally competitive when we keep cutting the budget in real terms and other countries are upping their science budget?
So, Julian, is this the ideal of investing 3% of GDP completely out the window, at least for a while, because it does involve this magic money that doesn't exist anymore?
I think firstly Emma's point is absolutely right, and is astonishing just how far behind we are. We're well below the OECD average. We are at least ahead of Italy in terms of how much we spend, which is which is something. Now, and the amount that we used to spend about 2.25% or so of our GDP on research and development. This isn't just government-funded research. This is industrial research. This is everything. That was where we were in 85. It went down from 85 to about 97. Don't know what happened in 97. It levelled off in 97, but it didn't go up. It stayed at a fairly low value of about 1.8%, sort of wobbling around a bit. And that's basically where we are now. Germany are almost at the 3%. Japan's well above 3%. USA is almost at 3%. That's where we need to be. It's not all about government spend. And while government spend has a role, one thing we do know is that government spend actually is very good at pulling in industry spend as well. You can get that matching money really very, very effectively. It crowds money in rather than crowding it out. So we need to do some of the things I talked about earlier, R&D tax credits, getting companies to invest and to invest here, because that way we really can get the sort of things we want to see. At Cambridge, sorry to pick up my constituency, Isaac Newton's old constituency as well. He was a not very successful MP as well as a rather better scientist. But we have a huge amount of that R&D research going on. I don't know what the percentage is there, but as a result, we now have 1,600 tech companies employing about 57,000 people and generating 13 billion in revenue. So you can get it to go by having the clustering, by having the support for people to try things and develop. But we have to be there, else we are just going to fall further and further behind what's happening globally. So your question is absolutely right. Some of it is government spend, and we've talked about trying to increase that above inflation, is what I would like to see. A lot of it is just about getting companies to invest in R&D, to choose to be creative rather than to be rather more passive.
David, are you happy for us to be just sixth in the league of spending money on GDP, just ahead of Italy?
Well, it's certainly true that our percentage of GDP on R&D is one of the low ones. I'm not sure about six, but certainly it's below some of the others. Several comments. First of all, of course, we do have an extraordinarily productive and smart science community which takes a relatively modest input and turns it into more world-class science than anybody else manages with that scale of input. And secondly, I have to say, just having come back from a weekend gathering of science ministers and advisors over in Washington, and it was a confidential discussion, but close up, when you are talking to these guys, the picture that everyone else has got growth and we've got some tough regime is not quite the reality. When you talk to the Americans facing a second year of budget sequestration and cash reductions in their science spend, when you talk to people from Germany where there is a massive investment going in energy R&D because of their shift away from nuclear, but such a big challenge for them of ensuring they don't just become a sort of coal-burning nation again, which is where there's a risk they head at the moment, that it takes up a very high proportion of their scientific activity meeting this massive energy challenge. So when you look at it close up, I think our broadly based, highly diverse science and research community with a stable cash figure that has been delivered year on year in the life of this Parliament isn't quite such a bad deal compared with everyone else as people may fear.
David, you've said in the past that the science base benefits from investments from the previous generation when you've spoken about this. What sort of legacy are you leaving by this year-on-year cut?
Well, I think if you combine it with the fact that we've been able to rebuild capital so that we are going to go back through the £1 billion a year capital figure next year, I think, well, it's not for me to write my own epitaph, the others will judge, but I hope I'll be able to say that in very tough times, when public expenditure was being reduced, when we inherited an 11% budget deficit as a percent of GDP, we ended up keeping up activity. The judgment I made was, first of all, we should have a ring fence that included all current. We actually had a broader definition of the ring fence than the one we inherited. We wanted all current so that you could keep activity up in tough times. And we took a hit on capital, and I actually inherited a plan for big reductions in capital. We did take a hit on capital, but then the plan was to rebuild the capital, and we have now achieved that. In successive budgets and autumn statements, capital has been added. We've now got this long-term science capital spend. So I hope, and you will be the judges, not what I say that matters, it's what you judge. I hope at the next election, people will think that British science is at least as healthy and vigorous a state and at least as optimistic and proud of its achievements and looking forward to the future as when we came to office, and perhaps even in better shape.
Thank you, David. It'll be interesting to see how the ring fence is redefined after the next allocation. But Liam, you're not going to be able to do any better than David has, because you're not going to be able to magic money and have a real terms increase and spend more as a proportion of GDP if you were Science Minister.
Well, we have to be the people in our respective parties who are leading the charge and asking for more. And that certainly, is my sense of excitement is matched by that sense of duty, if you like. But I think there are a couple of other things you can do. I mean, I mentioned earlier about how this global lab around us is now changing shape and size very, very quickly. We have to become not just the world's best place to do science, but the world's best place to do collaborative science. This is a huge opportunity for us. I mean, if you look at if you look at the way China's leaders preface their 12-year plan with a burning critique of their own ability to be intellectual property creators rather than copiers, that's what's driving this huge $2 trillion investment in R&D in China over the course of this 5-year plan. And, they have to succeed in that if they want to deliver the China dream that Xi Jinping set out earlier in the year, doubling
but
living
you haven't
standards by
got the
2020.
money to do that, have you?
No, the point I want to make is that we have to look at the way in which we spend money, I think, a little bit differently. So examples like, for example, the US-Israel Binational Industrial Research and Development Fund, $300 million over the course of about 10 years, created 750 companies with about $8 billion in sales. That's an interesting and different way in which you can foster public and private long-term growth in R&D spending. There are now about 550 companies that control half of global R&D, about $600 billion. The truth is, if we don't move soon, they're going to move more and more of that towards emerging markets. We have to create incentives to keep some of that spent here. And one of the ways that you do that is through some very long-term investment frameworks. And so that's why long-term frameworks and long-term allocations for capital are so important. And it's why in serious areas of R&D spending, like defence, you do need an industrial policy, you do need an industrial strategy, so that the sector is very clear about how Her Majesty's government will take make or buy decisions. That has a huge impact on what they will invest here versus elsewhere. So thinking, anew about how we do collaborative science is important. David published a paper a year or two ago. It was the BIS Innovation and Growth Strategy. That the chapter 5 on collaborative science was a good start, but it needs a.
At last, I found someone who's read it.
It's a strategy. It's a strategy. It needs a strategy of its own.
Nobody I've ever met has ever referred to that document before.
No, it's a good starting point, but it needs to be a strategy of its own. It's such a big deal. But in other areas of big spend, like defence, like health, we need some longer term plans.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I think it was Rutherford who said, we haven't got any money, so we'll have to think. And British science for many, many years has been based on that approach. We've done very well on it. But it's easier to think when you also have the money. And so while we are actually very, very good, and in some areas you don't need that much money to do some really interesting work, it would be easier. And to really make the sort of global changes that we need, to have the big world companies doing things here, we have to provide that security. I think Liam's absolutely right, that we have to get the pharmaceutical companies to stay in the UK, like AstraZeneca, which was done so well, to keep all of these people in the UK rather than them wandering off. And that does require a certain amount of assurance about, frankly, about everything that we've had, that they will stay here if we can say, look, we'll give you some really good skilled people, we'll give you people who are interested in science, we'll let people come from overseas, whether it's to work here or to come and have a look at the product you're trying to sell them, we'll let you do some blue sky thinking, and we'll have you next to a creative people so they can come up with the sort of the biotech ideas which your pharmaceutical company will develop. We have to get all of that going, and that will start to foster that R&D growth.
Thank you very much. Now, a question on diversity, or rather the lack of it, particularly at the higher levels in science, from Rachel Remedios, who's an administrator with the NHS. Rachel.
Hi, I'm actually really pleased this is something that's been sort of touched upon already. The fact that although more and more girls and women are studying science at school and at uni, the further up the career ladder you go, the less and less well women are represented in STEM fields. And I'm wondering what steps you think the government should be taking to combat this?
Thank you, Rachel. I mean, one of the most shocking stories I came across is that your chances of studying physics at university, if you're a woman, depends on where you live. Half the state schools in England don't send a single girl to study A-level physics. So I think it's still a problem low down, but also higher up. Liam, maybe you'd like to kick off.
Yes, well, my mum was a science teacher, and so I sort of feel quite strongly about this. And I think in a way that this is an issue that is too important to be left to politicians. It is something that all of us need to think about, and I think there are great companies, National Grid is one of them, who are, which are thinking anew about how they can get involved in schools to inspire people to understand the relationship between what they're studying in their exams and the kind of jobs that they might want to go and do when they graduate. So, I think broadly, there's three areas where we've got to look. One is, in the classroom, where you have got a situation where you've got half of state schools not sending girls to A-level physics. I know we load more and more onto Ofsted, but, can we really allow Ofsted to class a school as good or excellent if there is a complete absence of any effort to fix gender balance in science? I think that's something that we've got to ponder. Second, would you make Ofsted? Well, I'm not. This is something I want to hear views on, but I think you might question whether Ofsted should be allowed to class a school as excellent if there is simply no effort at all going into ensuring both girls and boys, and indeed ethnic minorities, and indeed disabled students, in taking and getting stuck into subjects where they're underrepresented. I just think, that's something that we've got to debate. My constituency 10 years ago was in the bottom 5% for sending children to university. And we're now the 13th most improved constituency in the country. One of the absolute keys to that change has been the work that we've done around fostering ambition, a kind of savoir-faire about what the ladders on and up in life look like. And key to delivering that has been a revolution in mentoring, getting successful graduates back into schools, working with their younger peers, and just giving a bit of inspiration and support and an ongoing relationship. And then, I'm afraid I do come back to the role of the career service. The destruction of the career service in our country at the moment is a really damaging thing for the long term. And unless we can find new ways of rebuilding it, getting industry involved in delivering that motivation and inspiration, then we will pay a very, very long-term price.
What strikes me is it's a bizarrely UK and possibly North American thing. In many parts of the rest of the world, engineering and science is seen as a good profession for women, and they go into it. Julian, what are your thoughts?
I think, firstly, the three of us are a very diverse group to be talking about this, which is, thank you for adding some diversity to what we're doing. And this is a huge issue, and
we are bald men fighting over a code.
The beard is but it is an issue. And as Liam touched on, it's not just about the shortage of women in these areas. And there is definitely an issue with the gender separation, but there are big issues with people with ethnicity, socioeconomic background, where in the country people come from. If you come from somewhere like Cornwall, there just aren't the same level of science centres and things that you can easily go to. And you can see huge numbers of these problems throughout. There's a lot that one can try to do things about role models, to have really good positive people where you see the female engineer who worked on the Shard, where you can see academics who've done all sorts of things. That's really helpful. Breaking down stereotypes, what a physicist looks like. There was a campaign in Cambridge among students for, I need feminism because, and fill in a reason. And one which struck me was a woman who's holding a placard which said, I need feminism because I don't want people to think you don't look like a physicist is a compliment. And there is a real issue that I see some people nodding here as So there's a whole lot of issues there about getting across the idea that, you know, anybody from whatever background, it doesn't matter, it shouldn't make any difference, can go on. So there's a whole lot of stuff at that end. There's also stuff that happens later after people have entered a career about career breaks. And there's still a lot of issues for typically women who have children and then try to get back in. There were some changes in the ref, I think, to relax the rules about numbers of papers and things like that. But it's still a really tough process. And a lot of people find it quite hard to get back in. You also do still have a whole lot of institutional sexism and all that sort of thing, which is still going on, and the judgment of what people can do. And if you haven't read the fascinating descriptions in Athene Donald's blog about sort of her anonymised and thinly in some cases, descriptions of the interactions, just what people expect a female academic to do. You know, there are real issues there. The same is true in companies. Some are fantastic. Not all of them are yet. There are still a number of places where you go and you look around and it's an entirely male world. And sometimes you can sort of understand why they're not attracting female candidates or other groups.
David, before I come to you, Rachel, could I ask you what you think could be done? Have you still got your microphone?
I'm not really sure, but I just graduated in physics this summer, and I kind of my instant reaction was to kind of turn away from it as something that, I didn't think, it's not something that people like me do, and probably because of mostly a lack of role models. So, I mean, I was kind of genuinely looking for answers, really. I didn't really have any of my own.
I mean, in the media, we've got a responsibility as well, and wherever possible, we do try and get, particularly on TV, female spokespeople on wherever possible. But our priority is to kind of get the person that's done the work to do the talking, and more often than not, it's usually a man. So I don't know what to do. David, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Well, there are practical. I mean, Sally Davis has done a very good job in the NHS, and the research councils have followed suit in trying to say that signing up to Athena Swan or something like it should be something we look for institutions receiving research funding. And of course, as I think I mentioned earlier, when I was able to announce the extra 200 million for teaching capital, again, we said one of the conditions for the competition in which you enter this is showing what you are doing on diversity. So we're trying whenever possible to create incentives for people to be smart. And I was grateful for Julian for mentioning it, because we discovered quite late on that in the ref, there was a danger that maternity leave would not be taken into account. Everybody would be expected to submit their 4 papers regardless of their personal circumstances, and it was possible to add some flexibility on that as a tiny gesture towards making life a little bit better. Often it's very tough as a postdoc. But I wanted to try out a theory about what goes wrong earlier on, because the most shocking statistic, I think, is the conversion rate of A star at GCSE into A levels. And it's fascinating. I'm trying to do this from memory, but one of the worst rates is only 25% of girls who get A star in physics GCSE carry on and do A-level physics. As against over 50% of boys who get A star in GCSE physics. For maths, the conversion rate is pretty much the same. Boys, slightly higher conversion rate than girls. And for biological sciences, it's the other way round. It's something like a 60% conversion rate for girls who get an A star in GCSE biology into A level. And my theory, let me try it out in this order. My theory goes as follows. I think that medicine is the science that teenage girls mainly aim at. That is what they have. Now, this goes back to the role model debate, but that is what many of them aim to do. That is why you start. So what you do is you stick with the biology and drop the physics and go full tilt down a path towards your aspiration of becoming a doctor. And then, having made that decision, the next cruel trick is that medicine is one of the few university courses which is rationed, because essentially we train the number of medics that the NHS say that they need. We don't set any longer any limits to any other things. So the number of people doing physics at university is not determined by the government. The number of people doing medicine at university is determined by the government and is highly rationed. So these girls advance down this route and all apply to do medicine at university. And then they find that despite having 3 A's, 4 A's at A-level and probably done summer work experience in some hospital in Soweto, despite all that, they can't get a place at university to do medicine. Whereupon normally they write to me and complain that it's because of Les Ebden and offer. But actually it's because there is a very tight limit on the number of places to do medicine. And then the final cruel trick, because they gave up physics at the age of 16, thinking they were going to become medics, converting from the course that they'd hoped to do and discover to their sorrow and disappointment they can't do, to something else in the sciences, like engineering, is restricted because many of them say, we expect you to have A-level physics. So my view is that through a series of policy mistakes and failures of policy design, we are sending these girls up a blind alley. And there are a large number of extremely frustrated 18-year-olds who have therefore thought they had a career route, which is then taken away from them. Now, what do we do about this? I think there are several lessons for us on this. I think
we could reinvent a career service.
Yeah, well, this is a long... Well, I'm pro-good careers advice, but this is a deep-seated problem. This isn't the sort of problem that's arisen in the, recently. I think it's actually more to do with... I think there are two problems. First of all, we specialise too much at 16. The real thing is that people are being forced to take decisions at 16, which profoundly affect the life chances. And I think the whole two cultures debate is much more acute in Britain than almost anywhere else because our education system imposes a two culture type choice on 16-year-olds in the way in which very few education systems do. So the fact that they are having to decide between doing physics or doing biology is a very bad thing. I think secondly, and this is a challenge for some of the other STEM subjects, and I'm sorry, there's a bit of a, I apologise in advance for the kind of stereotyping here, but the girls may be thinking that medicine is the caring thing to do if you're interested in science. And all the other sciences also make the world a better place. And if people were better explaining that engineering makes the world a better place, that physics makes the world a better place, if you want the world to be a better place, there are things that you can do alongside trying to cure human illness. There are other ways of making the world a better. I think that is a challenge for people in the other STEM disciplines to rise to that, along, of course, with the career model, role model challenge and everything else. But I think it is quite a deep-seated problem, and I do think we need some pretty radical solutions to tackle it.
David, thank you very much for that. And now a question on the use of scientific advice from Professor Bairstow from Leicester University. Professor Bairstow.
Thank you. So we face many issues at the moment. I think I can think of some topical ones: high-speed trains, fracking, bovine TB. They all rely on advice. And I'd like to know what the panel will propose to ensure that expert evidence is provided to politicians and government, and perhaps more importantly, that it's taken into account in setting policy.
David, I think badgers is a topical one at this stage. I mean, is the scientific advice being given correctly, or is it not being listened to, or I mean, what's going on?
Well, of course, first of all, scientists don't always agree amongst themselves, you know.
Well, no, I mean,
there can
on
be
the case
different
of badgers,
views within the
there is
science.
strong agreement.
And I've been present at some of the cabinet committee discussions of bovine TV and the badger cull, just like some of the other things. First of all, I would say that there are opportunities both for the chief scientist, now Mark Wolpert, previously John Beddington, to explicitly advise the PM and cabinet committees, as well as ministers in all departments now having a chief scientific advisor, and greater protection for the chief scientific advisor in the department than ever before in terms of the rules of conduct for ministers, for the first time explicitly saying that they have to protect and take due account of advice they get from the chief scientist. So I think...
But that hardly ever happens, does it? I mean, it's all done quite informally and or sometimes downright ignored without explicitly saying
there is a point. Well, let me first of all say there is indeed a point when the democratic politicians do decide things. And we are accountable to our electorates for what we decide. And yeah, that does. And I think part of the contract, if you like, is that the science advisors give their best assessments and estimates, but equally accept that ultimately it is democratically politicians who do have to decide. And there is and it is very possible to reach a range of different policy conclusions from the same evidence. But I think overall in Britain, when I look at, say, the Icelandic volcano, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but the Icelandic volcano, or the year after that, Fukushima. I remember going to Japan subsequently with David Cameron on a visit, and one of the main things that the then Japanese Prime Minister wanted to talk about was how John Beddington had been able to give advice that British citizens could stay in Tokyo and were not going to get radiation poisoning, how that had been accepted in Britain as sound advice. Nobody had thought that it was just a kind of diplomatic judgment by politicians that when he wanted good relations with the Japanese government, when he had said that on the basis of his independent assessment had been trusted. And the Japanese thought, they realized they had nobody who could communicate authoritatively about the scientific evidence and impact of Fukushima in the way that our chief scientist could. And they wanted to learn how to what extent the British model could be adapted and brought into Japan. So, I mean, there's always ways we can improve things, but my view is that the chief scientist, who is really the kind of chief empiricist in each department, is often commissioning research, putting the evidence before ministers, participating in policy discussions, submitting papers to cabinet committees, and are always listened to, but ultimately elected politicians have to decide.
Julian, do you think it's a system that works well?
I think it's fantastic that we have chief scientific advisors now in every department. It didn't used to be the case, as well as an overall one. I think the problem is that the departments are very variable as to how much access those chief scientific advisors have. How often do they meet with ministers? How are they asked questions, or can they proactively say, hang on, there is an issue here? And the departments vary from some fantastic models to some really quite thin ones, and that's an issue. I think it does work very well on crises. I think the difference about a crisis is it starts off with a politician saying, what do I do? Whereas on a lot of other areas, it starts off with a politician saying, this is what I intend to do, give me evidence to say why it's the right thing. And you see that too many areas. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff on drugs policy, which is the classic example where you have had a number of politicians in both governments saying, I know what the answer is, and I will find an expert who will tell me that it's the right answer. We have an example right at the moment with the drug CaSE, where the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which is supposed to recommend, made a very, very clear recommendation saying, do not ban it. And the Home Secretary decided to ban it. We're going to have the debate fairly shortly in Parliament about it, for fairly thin reasons. Effectively, where it's been banned, there has been gang crime happening. We haven't got any gang crime here, so we'd better ban it before the gangs start to try to sell things. It seems we don't have gang crime here because it's not illegal. So there are some good things. There are issues with understanding of science and the scientific process as well, because while you don't have to be a scientist in order to understand the process, and there are lots of people who prove that that's simply not a requirement, there is still a shortage of people who are interested and get it. In all the parties, we have people who just aren't very interested. There are also, again, some civil servants are extremely good at understanding when you need to get advice, when you don't. Some are less good. Some are too scared to give examples. There was, I won't say which minister, told me he was asking for policy advice on an issue and for the evidence of it. And he wasn't getting it, and he chased the people involved. And after a few weeks, they said, but Minister, you haven't told us what you want the answer to be yet. While that is happening, that is dangerous. But this thing about engaging is important, because sometimes people don't realise when you need to talk. So there was a thing which was floated a couple of years ago to say we shouldn't allow the use of explosives in classrooms. Now that sounds like a very sensible thing to do. The problem was that the definition that was being used of an explosive was any exothermic reaction, which is slightly broader than would be appropriate. And the issue was that happened for a while before somebody thought to talk to one of the scientific advisors who could immediately say, actually, hang on, you don't want to do that. So we have some good processes there, and there's a lot of work within Parliament, but it's not consistent. It's not good in all areas, and you will find people, sadly in every party, who don't take the sort of evidence-informed approach. It's absolutely right that politicians have to decide, ultimately. It's not a technocracy, but there isn't enough there at all yet.
I think the key issue is transparency. The instance you mentioned, Theresa May actually admitted what the advice was and the fact that she chose to ignore it. But that doesn't happen all the time.
Absolutely.
Liam, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think we've come an awful long way over the last 10 years. I mean, not just the network of scientific advisors, but also the statutory independence of the Office of National Statistics. I mean, frankly, that has done more to stop policy-based evidence-making in Whitehall than many other reforms over the last 10 years. I mean, the scientific advisors are crucial because, civil servants are there to, they're supposed to speak truth to power, but scientific advisors will often be there to explain truth to power. And increasingly, I think we should be looking to our scientific advisors not just to explain truth to power, but also explain truth to the public. And expanding the way in which we use Parliament, for example, to take evidence and get it out into the public domain, I think is one of the most important things that we can do to just carry on this reform process. I mean, just from my experience in government, I would just make two observations. One is that we have to continue to strengthen the role of scientific advice in the centre. The sharp-eyed will have noticed that although the Treasury has a scientific advisor, they're not actually independently appointed. That is something that we could fix. We should look at the role of departmental boards. I think they're currently underweight in terms of scientific advice too. But the real change, and Julian's example really kind of underlines this, is to get a lot more people with science backgrounds into the bloodstream of the civil service. Because, what is often desperately missing in the way the civil service puts together advice is evidence about evidence. Often the answer will not be clear, as David says, and what is needed is a systematic process, whether it's randomised controlled trials or another technique, to actually try and figure out what works and what doesn't. And frankly, we would save an awful lot of taxpayers' money if we introduce that more scientific approach to policy making. But that needs, I'm afraid, more people with scientific backgrounds, not just in the centre of government, but all levels beneath.
And it is worth saying there are a number of what works centres that have been set up by the government.
Yeah.
I think some of them are doing quite well. Some of them are having trouble because some of the things they say work, or rather things they say don't work, are things which politicians like to talk about and do. But I mean, those are actually quite an interesting model, and I think they can be developed.
Actually we have to distinguish between kind of science and, as I said, empiricism and kind of mathematical analysis. Because you see, I think we've just been able to announce, literally in the last few weeks, an initiative led by the Nuffield Foundation, but supported by both HEFCE and the research councils, is a £20 million investment in training people in quantitative social science techniques. So lots of people who give up maths at 16, they're interested in, say, social change or poverty and want to study social policy at university, but they haven't got the analytical tools to do the kind of rigorous analysis that the people from the physical sciences would recognise. So what we're trying to do is add funding so that when people are doing those types of courses at university, they have access to maths advice and maths teachers who take the opportunity, when you're first set a paper on poverty in Victorian England that has got a regression analysis in it, instead of panicking and skimming through that bit, you have a mathematician who is part of the service available for you on that course, says, I will help you through this, because actually mastering some of the maths of this is something you're going to get out of your university education. And as I say, we've literally, Q-Step it's called, we've literally launched this in the last couple of weeks, and I think it's one of the ways in which the teaching academic experience of students is a crucial opportunity to get people back into these kind of quantitative skills and empiricism, even if they sadly gave up on them at 16.
David, thank you very much. Now, time's flown on, and it's time for the final question, which is from me. No. And I'd like to ask each of you, fairly briefly, because the music for the end of question time is starting now, is each of you to explain what your vision for the role of science and engineering in the UK is, and crucially, how you would realise it. Julian first.
I think it's for science and engineering to be something which is available to everybody at the appropriate level, where you'll have specialists who are trained and really excited by what they can do, but also a broader public who sort of get the basics, who can interact with scientific ideas and engineering ideas, children who are excited by it, more money going in, more drive around the whole space. I think it would also be something, this is going to be my final plug, where it makes a difference whether politicians get it or not. Yeah. All of you will have constituency members of parliament. Some of them, whatever party they are, will be good at this sort of thing. Some of them will be bad at this sort of thing. If they are bad, tell them they should get good or you won't vote for them. If they're good, tell them to get better and you'll vote for them. But you have this opportunity to engage, and that will make a huge difference if we can get politicians who are interested, because you're seeing 3 of us who are interested, but that's not true for every member of the House of Commons.
Liam.
Well, 2 things really. I mean, I think we're on the brink of an extraordinary age. I mean, world wealth is going to double by 2030. There'll be 1 billion more of us, over 1 billion more of us. There will be a population that predominantly lives in cities. 80% of the world population will live within reach of the cloud. Data archives will be infinite. I mean, the possibilities ahead are extraordinary, but how we build, how we power, how we feed, how we keep healthy and safe that new world will be one extraordinary challenge. And what we have got to aspire for is for Britain to be amongst the greatest authors of the greatest answers in this greatest age of science that's ahead of us. I think here at home, I mean, I can't but start with a speech that was made in Scarborough 50 years ago this year by Harold Wilson. It was his famous speech around the white heat of the technological revolution, and it bears rereading because it's in that speech that he says for the first time, the scientific revolution gives us the power to transform living standards in a way that allows us to deliver a standard of living for everyone beyond that enjoyed by a few narrow classes in years gone by. That has got to be a big part of our ambition. We are the party of the white heat of the technological revolution. And in a country where, over the last 3 years, 80% of the jobs created have been low paid, where productivity is 7% lower, where there's still an investment crisis, we have got to harness science and innovation to create, real answers to the challenges that most of our constituents live with every day, which is this cost of living crisis where wages, I'm afraid, are not growing as fast as prices.
Thank you, Liam. David.
Well, I want to see a self-confident, optimistic scientific community producing great science, and I think we're making enormous progress there, and I think that is the mood that I sense in the science community. I would say the 2 challenges are first, more cross-disciplinary working and properly recognising that in the status that's accorded to the papers that you write that are cross-disciplinary and the promotion decisions that are taken. I think there are one of the great strengths we have is that even though we're only a medium-sized economy, we have got an extraordinarily diverse research base in so many different disciplines. We've just got to be world-class at connecting them up and rewarding people who connect them up. And the other thing, for me as a layman, you say, I'm not a scientist, I don't claim to be a scientist, I'm a layman. For me, I'm very fortunate. We're living in an age of really high-quality science communication. But the more that the science community can convey to lay people the sheer excitement of some of what you do. On Monday in Cambridge, I was given a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. I was given a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets in a few cells encoded through DNA with the text of Shakespeare's sonnets. And that kind of thing is just amazing, what people can do nowadays. And that type of excitement should be available and communicated to the non-scientists across our society.
David, thank you very much. And I just want to thank all of you. We've been very lucky to have the 3 of you talking together and also to have such a high quality debate. So thank you very much indeed.